Chapter 22 of Cause of Laughter. There is a time when there is a desperate situation, and the body are finally separated, and the deceased can't laugh or cry in peace. But he said that the gangster pointed the pistol at the forehead of the family tree, and only heard a snap. It turned out that Li Erqi saw it from the side, and kicked the pistol aside. He took a step forward, held his hand, and said, "What are you doing? Have you gone crazy?" The man laughed and said, "I have no bullets in my gun. Let's scare him and see how courageous he is. Who can kill him? The god of wealth beat him up." Li Erqi said, "What's the use of his courage? What if you want to scare him to death? Stop talking nonsense and let's go." So the 5 gangsters took turns supporting the family. The tree walked forward in the darkness. Jiashu was just about to recover from the fright. He saw that they were taking him to another place. He didn't know where they were going. He was so flustered that his feet were bumpy, so he followed them. After walking for about 20 miles, the east gradually turned white, and high mountains rose towards us. Just as Jiashu was about to part ways, Huguzi tore off a small piece of clothing and wrapped his eyes heavily. He supported the bandit and walked another step. He felt that his feet were climbing up the mountain step by step. He didn't know whether he was facing the mountain. After a while, I felt that there was no way under my feet, so I just climbed up and down the slope. There were often gravels and long thorns hanging on my feet. Although there were people helping me, I walked and fell. I was clearly climbing on a chaotic mountain. We are no longer on the right path. After walking for a long time, I stepped on the stone steps. I heard a few bandits push the door open, and then I stepped on a very flat stone slab. Where can there be such a place? In the mountains. But I don't know who it is. Later, when I walked to the long table and smelled a little old fragrance, I realized it was a temple. The bandits let the family tree sit on a haystack, and they were busy each other, as if they were familiar with the place. But they went to prepare firewood and water. Later, they closed the door of the Buddhist temple, got some dry firewood, and lit a fire in the middle of the temple. The 5 bandits all sat around the fire, discussing how to survive today and find a place tomorrow. Jiashu was very anxious when he heard that they were changing places again, and it was becoming increasingly difficult for his family to find them. The 5 bandits didn't leave that day, so they burned the sweet potatoes several times and ate them. Li Erqi said, "God of wealth, let's just make do with it for one day. Tomorrow we will find a way to get you something delicious." Jiashu was not polite to them and managed to eat the sweet potatoes. He just panicked all night, and again after running all these ways. How can I bear it? As soon as the firewood burned and there was a little warmth, I fell asleep. Jiashu slept in a daze for the whole day. He didn't know when it was, but he was sleeping soundly when he suddenly felt that his body was pinched by someone. The man ran a few steps quickly and put him down. I could only hear someone shouting, "Hey, you thieves, wake up. I'm a man who knows how to do secret things." When Jiashu heard that voice, it was none other than Guan Shoufeng. This joy was not trivial, and he didn't care about the benefits. He immediately pulled down the cloth that tied his eyes, and saw Shugu also coming. She and Shoufeng stood together at the door of the Buddhist temple. There were still lingering flames from the dry firewood burning in the temple. They saw Li Erqi Jian and his accomplices crawling up from the haystacks on the ground. Shoufeng shouted, "Stand still. If you move, the 2 guns here will fire together." It turned out that Shoufeng and Shugu each held a fast gun, and together they took aim at the 5 bandits. As expected, they didn't move. Li Erqiang lowered his hands and stood upright with a smile. "Friends, which way are you from? If you have something to say, why bother doing this?" Shoufeng said, "We are not from the same way. Don't blind your eyes. You are around. I have borrowed 2 of your guns. You also have a few pistols tied around your waist. Hand them over, and I will lead them away." As he spoke, he raised the gun again. When Li Erqiang saw that the situation was not good, he first took out a pistol from his body, threw it to the ground, and said with a smile, "It's nothing. People who travel in rivers and lakes sometimes have favorable winds, and sometimes capsize." Then he said. 2 more people dropped their pistols on the ground. Shoufeng turned the muzzle of the gun inward and asked them to stand at the corner of the room. Then he jumped into the middle of the room, picked up the pistol, and inserted it into the belt at his waist. He then retreated to the door of the hall and fired. He nodded and said with a smile, "I already know that you don't have any guns on you, but there is no guarantee that the other guys still have them. I have to wait here." After saying that, He took out one of the pistols inserted in his body and handed it to Shugu. He said, "You take Mr. Fan down the mountain first. Leave these people to me. They will be fine." Shugu took the pistol, squatted down in front of Jiashu, and said with a smile, "I don't have to worry about much now. My life is important. I will carry you on my back." Jiashu stretched out his hands without thinking about being humble, hugged Shugu's neck. She put the gun under her side, put her hands behind her back, supported Jiashu's knees, jumped up and down, and walked forward. In the dark night, I don't know where the family tree passed. After a while, it fell to the ground. Shugu put the family tree down and said, "Wait here for my father. Don't get lost." Jiashu breathed a sigh of relief, and then felt that his life was his. Looking up and looking around, it was dark and starry. The wind was blowing in the air, and the cold air penetrated into the sweat pores, making people shiver. Shugu also raised her head to look at the sky and said with a smile, "Mr. Fan, you are feeling very cold. Do you want to wear a worn-out coat?" As she said that, she jumped up and climbed up the tree. He took off a bundle roll from the tree, opened it, and found 3 old sheepskin covers. He took one with its collar and draped it over the family tree. Jiashu said, "How can there be such a thing in this place? Didn't the eldest girl bring it?" Shugu said, "My father and I each have one, and we have prepared the next one for you. When we go up the mountain, we will tie it on this tree." Jiashu said, "Uncle Guan and Miss Guan are so considerate. How can I repay you?" After hearing this, Shugu leaned against the tree trunk and remained silent. There was no sound at all. The two stood quietly for a while. They only heard the sound of footsteps. Shofeng, from far away, asked, "Are you here?" Before, Jiashu came forward and knelt down to Shofeng. Shofeng threw away his gun, picked him up with both hands, and said, "Little brother, you are a new person. How can you perform such an old ritual?" Jiashu said, "Uncle, at this old age, I don't know how to express my gratitude to my nephew for taking such a big risk to save him." Shofeng laughed and said, "Don't thank me, thank God." "What a nosy person." Jiashu asked, "Why did you come to rescue me after knowing this?" Shofeng said, "As soon as I heard about it, it was already very popular in the newspapers. Visiting. I heard that my apprentice, Wang Erbaluzi, said that there were some customers in the sweet forest who came to the countryside to sell rice seeds and persimmons, and they were acting suspiciously. I and several of my apprentices visited them one after another, and it turned out that it was not the case. On the right track. I was about to take action last night when the army opened fire with them. I hid behind the army and was really worried about you. Later I heard the army shouting and ran away. I thought you were out of danger early in the morning. At that time, I pretended to be passing by and saw several traces of people crawling in the ditch, all heading northwest. I searched until I found the road and saw some marks of gun butts. I immediately understood that they had climbed up the mountain here. There is a Zuandi temple in this mountain, and there have been no monks for a long time. I thought if they didn't come here, where would they go to hide? So we, my father and son, took advantage of them being tired yesterday to attack them tonight. Hiding in this mountain, he never dreamed that someone was plotting against him, so he let me rescue you easily. Otherwise, my father and son had no guns, and only brought 2 knives. It would be really difficult." After saying that, he laughed. At this time, there were a few cock crows in the distance. Guan Shofeng said, "It's almost dawn. Let's go. Stay here. Be careful to follow the thieves. These 2 spears will draw attention when you take them away. Let's destroy them and throw them into a deep well." So he removed the bullet, held the gun upside down, and smashed it on the rocks, smashing both guns. Shofeng walked together to a well by the road, threw it in, and said, "Yes. Don't keep it to harm others." So his father and daughter put on the old sheep's fur and walked towards the main road with the family tree. After walking for about 2 or 3 miles, the east gradually became brighter, and suddenly I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, as if several people were chasing me. Shofeng stopped and listened, then said to Shugu, "They are coming after them. You lead Mr. Fan away first, and I will deal with them." Seeing a high mound on the roadside, he took out 2 pistols and squatted down, hiding behind the mound. Unexpectedly, the few people who were chasing him didn't worry and kept chasing him. They saw a mound in front of them, and seemed to know that someone was hiding behind it, so they stood still and shouted, "Friend, the pistol you took has no bullets. Throw it away quickly. We are not afraid of you anymore. We are not afraid of you anymore." He didn't bring a gun. He's a hero. Come out and give us a show. After hearing this, Shofeng raised his pistol to the sky, and sure enough, there was no bullet. I wanted to walk out, but I was afraid that the robbers would have bullets and fell into his trap, so I kept silent and saw what happened to them. Only at this moment, someone jumped onto the mound and rushed over. Shofeng saw that he was holding a knife in his hand. Needless to say, he didn't have a gun. So he threw the pistol away and said with a smile, "It's just in time." He squatted back and stretched his body together and grabbed one of the man's legs, and the man fell to the ground with a thud. Shofeng kicked the knife away from his hand, then grabbed one of his hands, raised it, threw it to the opposite side, and said with a smile, "Fuck you. Go to hell." The two gangsters were about to move forward. The three people rolled into a ball when the person who was thrown over hit them. At this time, Shofeng saw two people standing behind him in the hazy dawn, without guns, and he was no longer afraid. He walked forward and said with a smile, "With your rolls, you want to rob someone? Go back. Don't come and die." Someone said, "Old man, what's your surname? You didn't ask me." Lear's jaundice is not easy to deal with. "I don't know," Shofeng said. Seeing him standing upright, Lear didn't dare to step forward. Another bandit raised a stick in his hand and struck at his head, regardless of whether he was good or bad. Shofeng didn't dodge, he just raised his right hand. The stick hit his arm and flew straight into the air. The man rolled to the ground. The two who were knocked to the ground first came over together, and Shofeng swiped and pushed them, and then rolled down. Seeing how powerful Shofeng was, Lear JG stood far away and said, "Friend, I've been in trouble today because I got to know you." After saying that, he turned around and left. After walking about 4 or 5 steps, he turned around and raised his hand, and something shot straight at Shofeng's head. Shofeng stretched out the middle finger of his right index finger upwards and pinched the thing. It turned out to be a steel dart. As soon as he saw it clearly, the second one of Lear's jaundice came again. Shofeng raised 2 fingers of his left hand again and clamped it again. Lear Jiang threw several steel darts at Shofeng's hand like a magnet. They were all attracted to his hand. He picked one up, threw another, and caught the last one. Shofeng said with a smile, "This kind of thing, how many do you have on you? Just throw them away. After you finish throwing them, it's my turn." After that, he raised his hand. Li Erk was afraid that he would really throw him out, so he ran away. Shofeng smiled and said, "I'm going to the city, and I don't have time to settle accounts with you. I'll give you an advantage." After saying that, he picked up 2 pistols and turned around and left. Shugu and Jiashu came out from a high slope and said with a smile, "I heard they didn't use their guns. I knew they were no match for you, so I didn't step forward." So the 3 of them said they would take them away, and they left at some point. After more than 10 miles, we reached a market town. There is a long-distance bus to Beijing, so the 3 of them took the long-distance bus into the city. When they arrived in the city, Shofeng had already made a roll of furs and weapons and gave it to Shugu. He told her to go home, but he personally sent Jiashu to Tao Bohi's house. Jiashu asked on the road, "Uncle still lives in Beijing. Where is he?" "You will know later, so there is no need to ask now." The 2 hired a rickshaw and took it to Tao's house. There was a messenger named Fan Duanben standing at the door. When he saw Jiashu, he turned around and shouted, all right, the nephew is back." When Jiashu walked to the inner courtyard, Bohi and his wife and his uncle came out to greet him. Bohi stepped forward and held his hand and said, "We have sent people to contact Chanta many times. How come he came out before we paid the money?" Jiashu said, "It's hard to explain in a few words. Let me introduce this lifesaver first." Then he introduced Guan Shofeng to everyone and went to the living room to tell them about the rescue. Fan Duanben was a man who had seen a lot of the world. Seeing Shofeng's vigorous spirit and dignified demeanor, he was indeed a heroic figure. He walked forward, bowed deeply 3 times to him, and said with a smile, "I can't repay a great favor. I just feel grateful and won't say anything. Empty." Shofeng said, "Supervisor Fan, you don't know that your nephew and I are good friends. When friends are in trouble, is there anything that they don't share? It's good that you don't say empty words." Liu Fu was serving tea at the side. Shofeng stroked his beard and smiled at him. "My friend, your cousin, you didn't suffer any loss by making friends with an old man like me, right? Don't look down on those who make a living on the Tianqiu Bridge. There are all kinds of people, but there are not many friends. In the future, We can have a few drinks and talk. You will definitely know how to practice the tricks, which is not bad. Liu Fu blushed with shame and dared not say anything, and retreated. Shoufeng bowed and said, "Goodbye everyone." He stood up and walked out. Jiashu chased him to the gate and asked, "Uncle, where is your house? I can go see you too." Shoufeng laughed and said, "I forgot that the place you went to in Daxi Hudong is my home." After saying that, he left with a smile. Jiashu went home and talked about the past again. Only then did he know that his uncle came to redeem the ticket. He had offered 50,000 yuans, and the army knew about it, so there was a night battle. Speaking of Guan Shoufeng and his daughter, everyone praised him. Fan Duanben wanted to exchange letters with him. Jiashu took a bath and had a haircut that day, and he went to bed early. The next morning, Jiashu went to Daxi Hudong to see Shoufeng. Unexpectedly, the north wind blew in the middle of the night, and it was already snowing early. Walking on the street, the snow was 1 foot deep, and the north and south were far away, but it was all white. The snowflakes in the sky were falling heavily, and the white houses and streets were covered by the white snowflakes, which were hanging with white strings and faintly covered, so everything was in a hazy white fog. Jiashu got on the car and passed through several streets in the cold white fog. He arrived at Daxi Hudong. He didn't know why, but as soon as he entered the Hudong, he felt strange, happy and miserable. He had pulled up the collar of his coat to cover his face, but now he put it down and the snowflakes fell on his face, but he didn't feel cold. At this time, someone suddenly shouted, "Isn't this Mr. Fan?" As he said that, a man chased up from behind the car. When Jiashu looked, it was Shen Sangshuan. He was wearing a gray cotton gown with black oil stains on the horizontal and vertical stripes. The small melon-shaped hat on his head was like a plaster, stained with a lot of snowflakes. He shrank his neck, held a 3-stringed instrument upside down, and ran up with hot air from his nostrils, holding the car with his hands. Jiashu jumped out of the car, paid the fare, and asked, "Why are you still in this state? Where is your home?" Shen Sangshuan squatted unconsciously and half knelt to greet Jiashu, and said with a sad face, "I'm really embarrassed to see you again. Once Lao Liu died, everything was over for us." Uncle Guan was really righteous. He heard the doctor say that Fengxi's illness could be cured by teasing her with things she wanted and people she wanted all the time in front of her, or she might slowly wake up. It happened that the original house here was vacant, so he paid the money and let's move back. Jiashu asked before he finished, "What's wrong with Fengxi? How is she?" Shen Sangshuan said, "She used to cry all day long. When she saw someone in uniform, she didn't care if they were soldiers, patrolmen, or postmen. She would say they were here to shoot her, and she would cry even harder. After moving to Daxi Hudong, she stopped crying and kept smiling foolishly. She doesn't recognize anyone except her mother, and the doctor said she has no memory. It's snowing so hard. Come to my house and sit down." As he said that, he led Jiashu forward. Not far away, Jiashu saw the familiar little red door. The 2 little red doors in the white snow were particularly eye-catching. However, the 2 locust trees in the wall only had white trunks with branches and twigs, not as lush and green as before. The door was half closed, and Jiashu pushed it, and it felt like he was electrocuted and his whole body became numb. The first thing he saw was the deep snow on the ground. A girl wearing black cloth pants and a red short jacket was standing in the snow, leaning against a locust tree, with her feet deeply buried in the snow. She was standing with her back to the door, and her fluffy short hair was covered with many snowflakes. There was a big bowl under her feet, which was covered with snow. There were many snow blocks around the bowl, which were round and flat, piled high, and looked like silver coins. They were printed on the bottom of the bowl. Some children in Beijing like to print fake foreign money like this on snowy days. Someone shouted from inside, "Child, come in. Uncle Fan will be here soon. I'm afraid you will make a fuss, but I dare not pull you out. What if you get cold?" Because she heard the door open, the girl suddenly turned around. Jiashu looked and saw that it was Fengxi. She looked as white as paper and even thinner. Shen Sangshuan stepped forward and said, "Girl, look, Uncle Fan is really here." With just this voice, Aunt Shen and Shoufeng and his daughter all ran out of the house. Shugu held Fengxi's hand in the snow, led her to Jiashu, and asked, "Big sister, look who this is." Fengxi tilted her head slightly, stared at Jiashu, smiled slightly, and shook her head. Jiashu saw that her eyes were dull, and in this state, He forgot all his resentment. He then asked her, "Don't you recognize me? Just think about it carefully." Then he took her hand, and they all went into the house. Jiashu saw that the layout of the house was roughly the same as before. His big photo was still hanging with a smile, but there were a few cracks in the middle, as if it was torn and put together again. In the middle of the room, there was a white coal stove. Fengxi stretched out a pair of bare hands, coaxed the fire, tilted her head, and just looked at Jiashu. When she looked, she was always smiling. Jiashu said again, "Do you really not recognize me?" She suddenly ran over and said with a smile, "You are using photos to frame me again, but photos can't speak. Let me touch it and see." So she stood in front of Jiashu and first touched the outline of his body, then touched his hands, and then touched his face. When Fengxi was touching, everyone saw that she was so stupid and pitiful, and they all stared at her blankly. Jiashu waited until she finished touching, then said, "Do you understand? I am a real person, not a photo. Aren't photos on the wall?" He pointed. Fengxi looked at the photo, then at the person, and her smile disappeared. She looked at Jiashu with her eyes, which turned a little, and then she closed her eyes, supported her head with her hands, thought for a while, opened her eyes again, nodded, and said, I remember. I remember. You are the master. It's not a dream. It's not a dream." As she spoke, her hands were shaking, and she kept saying it was not a dream, not a dream, and then her whole body began to shake. She looked at Jiashu for 4 or 5 minutes, and then she cried out. Aunt Shen ran over, supported her, and said, Child, what's wrong with you?" Fengxi cried, "How can I face the master?" After saying this, she fell asleep on the bed and burst into tears. Jiashu saw this and could not say a word, but just sat there. Shoufeng stroked his beard and said, "Maybe she has understood. Let's just let her lie down and wake up slowly." So he took off Fengxi's shoes, let her lie on the bed with her clothes on, and asked everyone to sit in the outer room. During this time, Aunt Shen and Shen Sangshuan kept repenting. Shoufeng kept comforting. Shugu often smiled. Jiashu was just thinking, but did not say a word. Shoufeng knew that Jiashu had not eaten, so he took out $2 and asked Shen Sangshuan to buy some wine and food, and invited them to sit around the fire to enjoy the snow. Jiashu did not refuse and stayed here. When everyone was sitting outside, Fengxi cried for a while, and then fell into a deep sleep. When everyone had finished eating, Fengxi was moaning inside. Aunt Shen went in and out several times for her. Every time she came out, she had to look at Jiashu's face. When Jiashu came to this room, all the past memories came to his mind. He felt very uncomfortable staying here, but he felt reluctant to leave. When Shoufeng talked to him, he would talk a few words. When Shoufeng didn't talk, he would just sit there silently. At this time, he frowned, picked up a glass of wine, and sipped it little by little with his lips, as if he heard Fengxi calling Uncle Fan softly. Shoufeng smiled and said, "Brother, no matter what happens, just tolerate it. She has come to this point. Do you still care about her? She is calling you. Go in and see her." Jiashu said, "Then, let's all go in and take a look." At that moment, Aunt Shen hung up the door curtain, and everyone came in. Fengxi was covered with the lower half of the quilt, revealing her 2 big red sleeves. Her pale and thin face now showed 2 big red blushes on her cheeks, and her messy hair was scattered all over the pillow. She saw Jiashu, and her little face hidden under the messy hair, nodded slightly, raised her hand halfway, waved, and pointed at the bed. Jiashu understood and took a step forward, wanting to see the bed. She sat down on the edge of the bed. When she looked back and saw these people, she sat down on a chair next to Fengxi's bed. Shugu folded one hand and leaned on the back of the chair. Fengxi moved her body, stretched out her hand and held Jiashu's hand and said, "This is real. This is not a dream. A lot of foreign money. I dreamed of riding in a car. I dreamed of living in a foreign building. Ah, he is going to throw me off the stairs, Sister Guan. Save me. Save me." As she said this, she supported herself with her hands and tried to sit up from the bed. However, she did not have enough strength. She only raised her head, and her hands could not support her, so she fell down. Aunt Shen shook her head and said, "She is confused again. She is confused again. Oh, what can I do? I have been happy for a while." As she said this, she burst into tears. Shoufeng also believed in the doctor's advice, and Fengxi had some hope of turning around step by step. but now she is not only not getting better, but her body feels even weaker. Standing behind him, he stroked his beard and nodded, saying, "This child is pitiful." Jiashu just felt that Feng Shi's hand was very hot. Now that everyone felt sorry for her, he could not say anything. Everyone was silent. Only a whirring wind passed by, and the rustling sound of broken snow blew up from the window. In the dark room, the coal fire gradually dimmed, and it felt doubly miserable. In the room outside, half-eaten wine and food were still placed, and no one asked about it. When he looked at Feng Shi again, she closed her eyes and kept saying, "This is not a dream. This is not a dream." Jiashu said, "When I came, she was still fine. In this case, I have harmed her. Let's just ask a doctor to take a look." Aunt Shen said, "That's good, but the doctor's visit fee is heard to be 10 yuan. Jiashu said, "It doesn't matter. I will give it to him." Everyone discussed for a while, and asked Shen Sangshuan to ask the doctor from the general hospital. Aunt Shen went to clean up the dishes. Guan's father and daughter and Jiashu were watching over the patient. Jiashu sat aside, with his feet on the stove to warm himself, and kept stirring the black coal balls with a fire chopstick. Shofeng put his hands behind his back, walked around the room, nodded, and sighed. Shugu sat sideways on the edge of the bed, combed Fengxi's hair, pulled her quilt, and felt her pulse, without saying a word. As a result, the three people in the room were very quiet. Fengxi fell asleep again. About an hour later, the car horn sounded at the door. Jiashu thought the doctor had arrived, so he went out to greet him. The doctor who came was the one who treated Fengxi's illness before. He walked in, looked at the room, and then looked at Jiashu, and asked, "Is this where Mrs. Liu's home is?" Jiashu felt that the three words Mrs. Liu were very harsh, so he said, "This is her mother's home." The doctor nodded and followed Jiashu into the house. Unexpectedly, the horn startled Feng Shi. She tried to get up from the bed, but couldn't. She just rolled around and shouted, "I was whipped and hurt, so you're going to take me to the hospital in a car? The soldiers are coming to drag me again. I won't go. I won't go." Guan's father and daughter went forward to hold her down and let the doctor feel her pulse. When the doctor came in, the doctor gave her an injection, saying it was to reduce her fever and calm her nerves. She shook her head and went to the outer room to ask about what happened. Seeing that Jiashu's clothes were different, she guessed that he was from General Liu's family, so she said, "I thought Mrs. Liu's illness was not very serious before. If we change her environment and gradually get rid of the bad impression, she may get better. Now her illness has suddenly worsened. It may be difficult for her family to take care of her. It's best to send her to a mental hospital." Then she looked around the house and said, "It's a government-run hospital, and it doesn't charge any fees. Please ask your husband to discuss it with the owner of the house. Mental illness cannot be cured by medicine. Otherwise, in such a simple family, I'm afraid." He smiled faintly. Seeing that he was unwilling to sit, Jiashu knew that he was going to leave, so he asked, "If she is sent to a mental hospital, when will she recover?" The doctor shook his head and said, "It's hard to say, maybe a lifetime. But she may not be that sick. Fortunately, if her family doesn't want her to stay in there, they can take her out." Jiashu couldn't bear to ask more questions, so he paid the consultation fee and let the doctor go. Aunt Shen shed tears and said, "I am so burdened by this child. If there is a place to recuperate, send her there. I only have one body left. Even if I go to help others, it will be better for my life." Jiashu saw that Fengxi's illness suddenly changed, and he also felt that the family could not afford to take care of her. If the family did not take good care of her, she might cause an accident. But he was afraid that Aunt Shen would not agree, so he could not force his decision. Now she announced that she wanted to send Fengxi to the mental hospital, which was very good. She agreed to subsidize the expenses of the mental hospital and ask the mental hospital to pick up Fengxi with a patient car tomorrow. After everyone discussed this matter, Aunt Shen had added a new red fire to the white stove. She brought a square stool and sat far away from the fire, with her fingers crossed and placed in her arms. She just looked at the fire and shed tears, and said, "I will be left alone in the future. This child is like..." She quickly grabbed her clothes and pursed her lips, her shoulders trembling, and she just choked with sobs. Shugu said, "Aunt, don't be sad. Otherwise, you can go to the countryside with us." Shofeng said, "You are talking nonsense. People put a piece of meat in Beijing. How can they leave it?" Joshua was filled with emotion, and today, unless he had to, he would always keep his head down and not speak. Suddenly, he took a step closer, held Shofeng's hand, and said, "Uncle, I have asked you several times, but you always refuse to tell me where you live. Now I have a solution that will satisfy both of us. I wonder if you will accept it." Shofeng stroked his beard and said, "We are not lacking either. Why should we satisfy both?" Joshua was stunned by his rebuttal and could not speak. Shofeng held his hand, shook it twice, and said, "I understand what you mean. What is the solution?" Joshua glanced at Shugu and saw that she brought a cup of hot tea, took a sip, and smiled slightly. "The art teacher had not been invited, so I wanted to introduce you to the school. Our school is also in the countryside, and there are many houses nearby, so you can live there. Moreover, we have attached primary and secondary schools for ordinary people, and girls can also go to school there. When I graduate in the future, I can accompany you to travel around the country and abroad," he said, and glanced at Shugu. Shugu looked at her father and smiled. "I'm still studying as a student. It's good that I'm learning to be a drummer at the age of 80. Shufeng nodded and said, "Your idea is very good. In 2 days, when the weather is sunny and warm, you can go to my home in Zishan's Huankui garden to discuss it in detail." Jiashu didn't expect Shufeng to agree without hesitation, but it was a joy in his distress, so he said, "Does your uncle live there? This name is so elegant." Shufeng said, "That's just the original name." Shen Sangshuan went in and out of the house, and couldn't find a chance to talk. At this time, he heard Shufeng talking about Huankui garden, so he interrupted and said, "This place is very good, I've been there too." As he spoke, no one paid attention to him. He said again, "Uncle Fan, you are still studying. You can get a job casually. Isn't your uncle very rich? If you are willing to promote me, please promote me or, recommend me a job and give me a bowl of rice." Joshua was annoyed when he saw his look, and he was even more annoyed when he heard this. He suddenly stood up and looked at him, and said, "Your relatives are much richer than my uncle." He said only these 2 sentences, sat down and looked at him, and couldn't say anything. Shofeng said, "Hey, brother, why do you have to argue with him? Sangshuan, why don't you go out?" Shen Sangshuan lowered his head and went out of the house. At this time, Aunt Shen was about to say something, but when she saw Shofeng opened his mouth, she was silent again. Shofeng said, "It's snowing heavily. Let's find a place to enjoy the snow and have a few drinks." Joshua really couldn't sit still, so he put on his coat and stood up. When he was about to leave, he heard a faint song. When he listened carefully, it was. Suddenly, I heard a lone goose cry, which really made people lose their souls. Poor my God. Lang is a sentimental man. How can? This is the autumn part of For Seasons of Longing sung by Feng Shi, sad and graceful, the same melody that she was taught to sing that day. She was stunned. Shu Feng said, "What are you thinking about?" Jiashu said, "Where is my hat?" Shu Feng said, "Isn't your hat on your head? You are really a little dazed." Jiashu touched it and suddenly realized it. He felt a little embarrassed and immediately followed Shu Feng. The two found a mud-in restaurant outside Zhonghua Gate and drank a few cups facing the beautiful buildings and flowers in the imperial city. While drinking, Jiashu mentioned the matter of inviting Shu Feng to be a martial arts teacher. Shu Feng said, "Brother, if I agree to you, I will be wronged. If I don't agree to you, I will bury your good intentions. I tell you, I am staying in Daxi Hutong for a few days for the sake of Miss Shen. You will understand when you visit my house in the future." Joshua saw that the old man was unwilling to give in, so he didn't say much. Shofeng said again, "We all have our own worries. Drinking alone can hurt people. 80% is enough. Don't drink anymore. You are not in good spirits. Go home and rest. Leave the hospital matters to me. We will meet in Daxi Hutong tomorrow morning." Joshua really felt that his body could not support it, so he said goodbye and went home. The next day, the sky was clear. The winter snow in the north is not easy to melt. After Joshua got up, he wanted to go out. Bo, he said, "You have suffered for more than half a month. Take a rest. The whole city is covered with snow. Where can you run?" Joshua couldn't leave in front of them, so he had to endure it. He waited until no one was paying attention, and then went to Daxixi Hutong. From a distance, he saw a van from the hospital that was picking up patients, parked in front of the Shen family's door. When he walked into her house, Aunt Shen was holding onto the tree, standing by the remaining snow, crying tears, but choking slightly, with her mouth open but no sound, and unable to close it. Shugu ran out with red eyes, and said softly, "Auntie, she's coming out soon, don't cry." Aunt Shen lifted her clothes, and wiped away her tears with all her might, then said, "Uncle, you're here at the right time, it's worth it. Please see her off. Isn't this just sending her into the coffin?" As she spoke, she choked up again. Shugu wiped her tears and said, "Don't cry. Let her get in the car quickly, otherwise she will get angry and it will be difficult to deal with." Jiashu was also saddened to see her like this, and stood aside, unable to move. Shofeng shouted from inside, "Sister-in-law, come in and help her." He wiped his face with a towel and went into the house. After a while, Shofeng turned sideways, held Fengxi with both hands, and walked out. Fengxi's hair was comb shiny, and her face was a little rouge powder. She wore a purple satin jacket over a cotton robe, long stockings, and a pair of single shoes. Aunt Shen walked side by side and also helped her hand. She smiled and said, "Why don't you change clothes? There are plenty in the box. Don't save money." Although she had a smile on her face, her eyes were straight. When she came out of the yard, she saw Jiashu, but she stared at him blankly and smiled. Let's go to the opera. The car is waiting at the door." After looking for a while, she was suddenly surprised, and pointed her finger, and said, He, who is he?" Shofeng was afraid that she would make a scene again, so he took her and left, saying, "The show is about to begin." Fengxi walked to the gate and suddenly stopped, shouting, "Don't be in a hurry, don't be in a hurry. What's on the ground? Is it flour or silver?" Aunt Shen said, "Child, don't you know? It's snowing." As she was delayed, Jiashu came forward. Fengxi laughed and said, "It's impossible for it to snow in July. I remember it was a dream. I dreamed of Uncle Fan and flour falling." Then she said to Jiashu, "Master, don't scare me. I tore the face off." As she said that, her face changed and she was about to cry. The servants on the car just waved to Shofeng, telling them to get on the car quickly. Shofeng made another effort and carried Fengxi into the car, but only Aunt Shen got on the car. She stretched out a hand and waved to the outside. The servant pushed her hand and slammed the car door shut. There was a small glass window on the car, but Fengxi was clinging to it. Looking out the window, his hair was messy again, his collar was crooked, but he just smiled at the people who were seeing him off at the door and said, "Let's go to the opera, let's go to the opera." Snowflakes rolled on the ground, and the car drove away. Guan's father and daughter, Shen, Sangshuan and Jiashu stood at the door together, all unable to speak. Jiashu looked at the two wide wheel tracks at the door, imprinted on the frozen snow, sighed, and just lowered his head without raising it. Shofeng patted his shoulder and said, "Brother, you go back. See you in Zishan in 5 days." When Jiashu turned around to look at Shugu, she also nodded and said, "Goodbye." Here, Jiashu nodded, and just as he was about to leave, Shen Sangshuan smiled and greeted Jiashu, saying, "I'll go to Tao Mansion to say hello to the master in 2 days, okay?" Jiashu took out a few banknotes from his pocket, stuffed them into his hand, and said with a stern face, "We won't know each other in the future." Turning back to Shofeng, he said, "I will be there in 5 days." He turned around and walked away. The frozen snow on the ground was solid at the time, and it became even smoother after being trampled by pedestrians and horses. Jiashu took only 2 steps and fell in the snow with a plop. Shofeng rushed over and asked what happened. Jiashu stood up and said that the road was slippery. He shook off the broken snow on his body, grabbed the collar of his coat with both hands, and continued to move forward. For some reason, he only walked 7 or 8 steps more, his feet slipped, and he rolled into the deep snow again. Shugu exclaimed, "Yo," and ran up to him. Just as she was about to bend down to help him up, she retracted her hand when she saw that he had climbed up. Jiashu stood up, held his head with his hands, frowned and said, "I must be dizzy. How could I fall twice in a row? Come here, Shugu is hired," and smiled to Jiashu. "I'll take you to the door of your house." Shofeng nodded and said, "Okay, I'll wait for you here." Jiashu kept saying I don't deserve it, but he didn't refuse very firmly. The two got in the car together. Jiashu's car was in front, and Shugu's car was in the back. He said a few words to Shugu on the way, and she agreed. Later, the 2 cars slowly drove away. When they entered the entrance of their alley, The car behind them didn't turn around and went away. When Jiashu returned home, he lay down on a sofa. He didn't know whether he was happy or miserable. He just said that he was uncomfortable and fell asleep. Because Fan Duanben had to go back to his post early the next morning, he forced himself to get up, accompanied him for dinner, and went to bed early. The next day, Jiashu and others Fan Duanben left, and he also went back to school. When his teachers and friends saw him, they couldn't help but express their condolences. When they heard that Jiashu was rescued by Shofeng and Shugu, they all said they wanted to meet him, and it would be best if Shofeng could be the martial arts teacher. Jiashu saw that his classmates had made the suggestion first, which was exactly what he wanted. On the 5th day, he took a car and went straight to the West Mountain along the main road. When he arrived near the Bian Temple, Jiashu asked the villagers and found out that there was indeed a Huankui garden. Huankui garden was surrounded by the foothills, with a short wall around it, and there was a small garden inside. A very exquisite Western-style building was facing him. Jiashu said to himself, "It's not right. How could they live here?" He hesitated in his heart, but he was still fascinated by the Western-style building. He looked to the left of the door, and then to the right of the door. Just when he was unsure whether to go forward or backward, he suddenly saw Shugu jumping down from the corridor downstairs. While walking forward, he smiled and waved to Jiashu, saying, "Come in. Why are you looking at me?" Jiashu had never seen Shugu so lively before, which surprised him. He went forward and asked, "Where is the uncle?" Shugu smiled and said, "He will be here soon. Please sit inside." As she said that, she led the way in front, into the Western-style building, and then led to a living room. The furnishings here are extremely gorgeous, with 2 connected living rooms. One side is decorated with red sandalwood, carved furniture and Chinese antiques. The other side is decorated with Western furnishings and velvet sofas. Jiashu thought, novels often describe how a heroic character's home is as rich as a king, and it is true. Thinking in his mind, he just looked around. Just as he was about to look at the inscription on the calligraphy and painting, Shugu stretched out her hand to stop him, and said with a smile, "Please sit here." Jiashu had never seen her chatting and laughing so casually, which was even more unexpected. He smiled and said, "Is there any secret?" Shugu said, "Of course there is." Jiashu said, "Is this the mansion?" Shugu heard this, and couldn't help but giggle and nodded, saying, "Please wait a moment, I'll tell you later." At this time, a waiter brought tea. Shugu looked at him and seemed to say hello. Then she said, "Mr. Fan, let's go upstairs and sit down." Jiashu didn't know where he was at this time, and he was at her mercy, so he went upstairs. Upstairs, he was sitting in a study. Behind the study was a round door with 2 yellow curtains hanging down, which made it more elegant. There seemed to be a small Buddhist hall in the yellow curtain, with many hanging Buddha statues and Buddhist niches. Jiashu was about to look out when Shugu shouted, "Guests are coming." The yellow curtain moved, and a woman in a gray cheongsam with a yellow face came out. When the 2 saw each other, they were both surprised and shrank back. It turned out that the woman was Helena. She smiled and nodded first, and said, "Hello, Mr. Fan." Miss Guan only said that someone wanted to introduce me to someone, but it turned out to be you. Jiashu couldn't answer for a moment. He just said looked at Shugu and said, "This is surprising. How did you 2 meet here?" Shugu smiled and said, "Mr. Fan, why are you surprised? Speaking of which, we should thank you for introducing us in the park. I moved out of the city and lived near here, and Miss He and I became neighbors. One day, I met Miss He at the gate of this garden, and we started to get along. She said that she moved to the countryside and would never go to the city again. She told people that she was going abroad. We should be considered to be meeting in a foreign country." After saying this, she smiled again. After listening to her, Jiashu suddenly realized, this is the West Hill Villa of General He, and he fell into the trap of Guan's father and daughter again. Facing Helena, it was inconvenient to say anything, so he had to say vaguely, "Excuse me for being so presumptuous." Although Helena was very dissatisfied with Jiashu, the ground was covered with snow, and since he had come in person, she should be extremely forgiving. Therefore, she did not ask how he came, so as not to embarrass him. She was very polite, and asked him and Shugu to sit in the study, and asked with a smile, "When did you come back from Tianjin?" Jiashu replied, "Not long ago." "How is Mr. Tao?" "He is very good." "How is Mrs. Tao?" "Is it snowing heavily?" Jiashu said, very heavy. At this point, Helena had nothing else to ask, so she rang the bell to ask the waiter to serve tea. After the waiter brought the tea, Helena remembered something and smiled at Shugu. Where is your father? Shugu lifted a corner of the curtain and pointed downstairs. Isn't that it? Jiashu looked and saw 2 donkeys and a camel outside the wall. There were several pieces of luggage piled on the camel, and Shofeng was driving the animals to the door. Jiashu said, what are you doing? Shugu pointed again and said, look, there is a small house under the trees. That's my home. Isn't it very close to Miss? But today, my father and I have left that house and are going back to our hometown in Shandong. Jiashu said, is it impossible? He only said these 3 words, but couldn't continue. Shugu ignored him and smiled and said, you too, please see me off. After saying that, she got up and went downstairs. Lena and Jiashu went downstairs together and followed to the garden gate. Shofeng took the small whip in his hand, smiled and bowed to Jiashu, and said, you are surprised again, right? Goodbye, goodbye. Helena held Shugu's hand tightly and said in a low voice, Miss Guan, only today can I know you completely. You really deserve it. She shook her hands and said, I told you a long time ago, don't be polite. As she said that, she let go of Helena's hand and straightened the reins of the donkey. Shofeng was already leading a donkey. Jiashu stood in front of Shofeng for a long time before he said, can I give you a ride? Shofeng said, sure. Shugu smiled and said, take care to Helena, then slowly walked onto the road and said, Uncle, I know you're a vagrant, and no one can stop you. But I wonder if we can meet again? Shofeng smiled and said, there are times in life when we meet again, don't you understand? It's a pity that I tried my best for you, but I only did 1 point of my best. It's cold. Don't give me a ride. With that, he and Shugu each got on the donkey, gave a whip, and went their way. Shugu looked back twice on the donkey, ran about a few dozen feet, and then turned around with the donkey, walked to Jiashu, and said with a smile, really, don't send me off, be careful not to catch a cold. After saying that, she turned the donkey's head and galloped away. But there was something that she took out of her arms and threw at Jiashu's feet. Jiashu picked it up and looked at it. It was a paper bag. When he opened the paper bag, there was a willow of black and thin hair, and a half-length photo of Shugu herself. There was no word on the front. Turning over the back, there were 2 lines of words saying, Miss, he said that you don't approve of the second half of the 13th sister. You have a good conscience and good vision, so keep this as a memorial. Jiashu read it twice, suddenly realized, raised his head, and her father and daughter were gone. Facing the road illuminated by the setting sun, he shed a few tears unconsciously. Jiashu was feeling sad, but he didn't expect someone behind him to say, this father and son are so nice. I can't bear to leave them. When he turned around, it was Lena, who had caught up with him. She smiled and said, Mr. Fan, can you come over to our place and sit for a while? Jiashu quickly stuffed the paper bag into his body and said, I'm going to get a room at Zishan Hotel first, and then we can talk later. Helena said, then, you won't go back to the city today. Can you have dinner at my place? Jiashu couldn't refuse, so he said, I'll come. So he said goodbye to Helena and walked to Zishan Hotel. He opened a window to the outside of the building and sat under the window alone, looking at the photos, then the road, and then the tuft of black hair. He just thought, it's really hard to guess the behavior of this kind of person. Is she affectionate or heartless? The inscription on the photo said that she was a bachelor. Judging by the tuft of hair, an old-fashioned woman would never give her things away easily. She had never had her hair cut, so precious hair. She gave it to me. Needless to say, we were close friends. But she was trying to get me and Fengxi back together, and to get me and Lena together, so she was definitely not a self-made person. The more I thought about it, the more I couldn't figure it out, so I just sat there. When it got dark, Helena sent a messenger to bring a sedan chair, saying that the driver had asked him to rest, and invited you to take the sedan chair to dinner. Jiashu couldn't refuse her kindness, so he put down his things and went to Helena. At this time, a small gasoline lamp had been lit in the living room downstairs of the He family villa, illuminating it as bright as day. As soon as Jiashu entered the door and took off his coat, Helena came forward and took his coat and hat for the messenger. When she saw many snowflakes on the hat, she said, "Is it snowing again? I was careless. The sedan chair here is just a name, but it is actually to poles that lift a chair." You are covered in snow and cold. You should have been picked up by a car. Jiashu smiled and said, It's okay, it's okay. He rubbed his hands and sat down close to the stove. The stove was crackling, the fire was burning, and the room was as warm as spring. On the table and coffee table in the living room, there were many bonsai of late chrysanthemums and early plums, as well as begonias and lotus, which were thriving. Jiashu just looked at the flowers. He sat down to look at them, then turned around and stood up to look. Helena said, What's so good about these flowers? And walked over. Jiashu saw that her face was already lightly powdered, not as yellow as when he first saw her, so he said, It's snowing outside, but there are flowers inside. I admire the skills of Beijing florists. Helena saw that he was still looking at the flowers, and she felt shy, so she said, Please have a cup of hot tea, and then we'll have dinner. So saying, she personally brought him a cup of hot tea. As soon as Joshua took the teacup, he could smell a floral scent, which was the freshly brewed roast tea. While Joshua was drinking tea, he, Lena and a maid had already placed 2 sets of chopsticks and plates opposite each other on a round table. Then the dishes were served, but there were only 4 bowls and 4 plates, all vegetarian. A bowl of white rice was placed on the side, and there was no wine. The most special thing was that there were 2 silver candlesticks with a pair of big red candles on top. Helena smiled and said, There is one thing that is not good about living in the countryside. There is no electric light. Joshua did not pay attention to her explanation, so he put down the teacup he was holding in his hand and sat down to eat with her. Helena pushed the dishes in the bowl with her chopsticks and smiled. I'm sorry, they are all vegetarian dishes, but they are all made by me. Joshua said, I really don't deserve it. Helena waited for him to eat a few dishes, then asked, How does it taste? Joshua said, Good. Helena said, If you are used to eating vegetables, it will be very good. As soon as I came to Zishan, I became a vegetarian, she said, looking at Joshua to see if he would ask questions. He didn't ask, but agreed. I agree with being a vegetarian. It's very hygienic. Seeing that he didn't ask why, Lena had to let it go. After a while, the meal was over, and the maid brought the towel and collected the dishes. At this moment, there were only 2 red candles on the table. Lena and Joshua sat down on the sofa opposite each other, each holding a cup of steaming rose tea and sipping it slowly. Helena looked at the pot of red plums on the coffee table and asked, Do you think I am a vegetarian for hygiene? If you don't know, others will know even less. Joshua paused, then said, Oh, and said, Yes, miss, he is studying Buddhism now. Why is a young man in the golden age so negative? Lena pursed her lips and smiled, put down the teacup, and walked to the chatterbox beside the room, opened the box, took out the chatterbox from a drawer and put it back, while smiling. Why, don't you understand at all? The child started to sing, which turned out to be a drum book of Dayu said autumn. When Joshua heard that the quiet and cold Jiaoxiang courtyard, gusts of west wind blew the green gauze window, he didn't realize that the teacup in his hand fell down, and he cried out, Ah! Fortunately, it fell on the carpet and did not break, but only spilled a cup of hot tea. Helena stopped chatting and asked, What's the matter? Joshua picked up the teacup calmly and smiled. I'm afraid of this sad tune. Helena smiled and said, Then, I'll change to a piece you like. As she said that, she changed a film. It turned out that the film had a long dialogue, and one of the lines was, You just kowtow 3 times to this red candle, which was exactly the part of the 13th sister in Nengren Temple. When Joshua heard it, he suddenly remembered what happened that night when he went to the opera, and smiled and said, Miss you have a good memory. Helena stopped talking and stood in front of Joshua smiling, and said, Your memory is not bad either. With just this sentence, the window opened with a snap, and a bouquet of flowers was thrown in from outside. Joshua walked up, picked it up, and saw that there was a small red silk strip on the flower with a line of words written on it. Guanshugu bows and congratulates. When I looked out the window, the snow had just stopped. The moon shone on the snow. The sky was white and clear. There was no trace of people. Joshua suddenly felt something in his heart. He felt very sorry for Shugu. He was overwhelmed with emotions and suddenly shed a few tears. Because the window was open, Helena blew in a gust of cold wind, which made the candlelight flicker. She quickly closed the window and took the bouquet of flowers. Joshua took out a white chrysanthemum and stood facing the window with his back to the light. Helena looked at the silk strip on the flower and laughed. Look, the eldest daughter of the Guan family is playing such a big joke on us. Jiashu still stood with his back to the window and said nothing. Helena said, how could she let you see someone like her who comes and goes so fast? Why are you still staring at her? Jiashu said, 2 grains of sand were blown into my eyes. As he said that, he wiped his eyes with a handkerchief and turned his head back. Lena thought, everywhere is covered with snow. Where does the wind and sand come from? She smiled and said, eyes are like love. There can't be a grain of sand in them. Don't you think so? As she said that, she raised her eyebrows, her 2 dimples spun, and looked at Jiashu. Jiashu stood there blankly holding the chrysanthemum in his left hand and picking the stem of the flower with his thumb and index finger of his right hand. After a while, he smiled slightly. It is exactly, after all, the colors in the world are empty. The shrike and the swallow go east and west. It is pitiful and hard to hide. It is just in the smile of twisting the flower. However, Helena had no idea of the twists and turns of this smile, so she stretched out her hand and covered the glass window with the purple curtain to prevent Jiashu from looking out again. The light in the room reflected a pair of figures on the purple curtain. The cold moon in the sky outside the window is cold and lonely. In such a world of ice and snow, it shines on such a house full of spring. With these 2 beautiful shadows, I can't help but smile with envy. Alright, this part of the story ends here.
Want to know what happened next? Let's listen to the breakdown next time.